Hello and welcome to Setting the Stage, episode 78, D&D in Suburbia, featuring Ryan and Serenity Springs. Ryan wrote Serenity Springs as a Kickstarter project that should be coming out real soon, so you can check it out there. It's a D&D in Suburbia. I don't know what else to say. Let's get through those ads, unless you're on Patreon, and you can hear more about it. I'm here with Ryan from Grinning Portal Games. Hi, Ryan.
Hi.
And today we're going to talk about Serenity Springs, which is a new Kickstarter project you have coming out soon, which looks really cool to me. Yeah. But before we get to that, I always want to talk to my guests about like who they are outside of RPGs. You know, we want to get a broader picture of who I'm talking to. So who is Ryan outside of RPG stuff?
Yeah. So I live in Portland, Oregon. I'm a web developer by trade. I spend a lot of time doing RPGs, obviously, but games of all kinds are a big interest for me, including board games and video games. I kind of dabble in all of them, although RPGs is obviously the place I've done the most actual creating.
Mm-hmm. No, that's cool. Like I like Portland. I've been there a few times.
Yeah, you're down in California, right?
Yeah. I've got some family up in Portland, so I go there. Well, I guess I used to go there pretty frequently.
Yeah, it's a nice place. I've lived here my whole life, and I don't really intend to move. I like to travel, but I want to stay living here.
Yeah, no, I totally get it from being in that area. It's really nice. And you do get snow, unlike me. I get nothing.
Yeah, occasionally. Although right now it's been weirdly perfect, like blue sky weather for basically all of January, which is strange but welcome.
Hmm. Okay. Yeah, we've been getting all the clouds down here in California.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. What got you started playing RPGs?
I feel like the answer starts this way for a lot of people, but back in college,
Uh-huh,
um,
it does.
yeah, a friend of mine wanted to run the at the time new 5e. I had never played before, but I was curious, and yeah, I distinctly remember the moment of like, oh, I can do anything I want, and kind of having my mind blown by that. Having played a whole bunch of video games and board games before that, just the sheer flexibility was a lot to take in and also really exciting. And so yeah, we did that campaign, and I did a few campaigns here and there from that point on. And then I started running, I think in 2018, 2019, something like that. And yeah, I've just been running different campaigns ever since.
Cool. So you stayed mostly with D&D for that track record?
So yeah, the vast majority of stuff that I've run has been D&D, although lately I've been wanting to expand out a lot more. I did a small campaign recently that was Triangle Agency, which then kind of morphed into Monster of the Week instead. I've done a little bit of Blades in the Dark, a little bit of Call of Cthulhu. I really like games in general, and so it's really interesting for me to just try different things and see how different designers create different tones and atmospheres with different mechanics.
Yeah. I mean, even just the difference between different Powered by the Apocalypse games can be pretty extreme.
Oh yeah.
Well, yeah. Like you said, it's a fairly typical story. I we usually get either started in college or introduced by family member. So
Yeah, yeah, I am by far the dorkiest member in my immediate family. So I mean, the good news is I have a nephew who I will be introducing to D&D at some point. So,
oh, cool. All right.
perpetuating the cycle that way.
Yeah. Gotta train the next generation.
Hmm.
Well, yeah. So you've got the Serenity Springs setting and adventure that's coming out on Kickstarter soon. And that's what we're here to talk about today, which is a pretty cool setting and unique because it's like 1950s American suburbia, which, is very alien to what D&D usually expects. And it
Yep.
is a D&D setting, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So what gave you the idea for that?
It's bit of a long story, but fortunately, it's a long podcast. So,
That's what we're here for, yeah.
yeah. So, are you familiar with Ravenloft?
Yeah, that's the kind of what Curse of Strahd is, but older.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Curse of Strahd is the most famous thing in Ravenloft, but very broadly speaking, for people listening who maybe don't know, Ravenloft is a D&D setting that's actually a collection of small settings that are horror focused and always focused around one individual who's done some horrible crime, and the dark powers, these ephemeral Lovecraftian gods, have made a special, unique hell just for them, just to torment them for whatever horrible thing they did. And so a few years ago, uh, in 2020, I ran Curse of Strahd and learned about Ravenloft, and just fell in love with the concept, and really, really, really enjoyed it, and really wanted to expand it out further and see what all it could do. That was also when Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft came out, and yeah, it was just really, really inspiring. And a few years after that, I ran what is to date my longest campaign, which was about 2.5 years, and it was a Ravenloft domain hopping game. So the players all worked for an agency that was dedicated to shutting down the domains of dread, and went from domain to domain to try to do that. Of course, it got much more complicated than that, but yeah.
Cool.
And then somewhere in that, pretty early on in that process, when I knew I wanted to do a domain hopping campaign, it occurred to me that I would like to make my own domain of dread. And the 50s horror suburb idea emerged almost immediately. It didn't happen until much later in the campaign, but suffice it to say, the idea had been floating around for a really, really long time. And that's what ultimately became Serenity Springs. And I do have to highlight, I've just talked a lot about Ravenloft here, and technically Serenity Springs is not going to be part of Ravenloft, because complexity with which license you use when you publish content for D&D. I'm not going to be using the Ravenloft branding or any of that kind of stuff, so that I can actually put it on Kickstarter and get better royalties and actually retain control of the thing, and that kind of stuff. So it's all inspired by Ravenloft, but it's not technically Ravenloft.
Yeah, D&D is very protective of their trademarks, so you can't use any of their trademark stuff when you're launching your products or when you're advertising them. So like, you can say D&D inside of the book, but it can't say it on the outside.
Yep.
Is one of the weirder ones. And
yeah,
I think it's also like, if you do like Ravenloft is part of their trademark, so you can't really use that inside of the book unless you publish through the DMs Guild.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And I've already published through the DMs Guild once, and I'm happy with that product. It's a time loop murder mystery on a ghost train that does explicitly take place in Ravenloft. But I am not happy that project is locked to DMs Guild. Like, I can't take it anywhere else. And I'm also not happy with how much money Wizards of the Coast takes. So that's why I'm going the different direction.
Yeah, it's like an extra 10% for DM's Guild compared to just normal drive-through, I think.
It kind of depends, but DM's Guild always takes 50%, which is pretty brutal.
Yeah. Compared to Kickstarting, where you get all the profit.
Yep.
Well, yeah, no, I think that totally makes sense for you to move to that, especially after you've had like a success of just publishing something on your own. It makes you more like verified for wanting to pay you ahead of time on Kickstarter.
Yeah. Yep, exactly. I have a teeny tiny audience, and I have a few hundred people here and there that I've sold to before, that, I can show the world that, yes, I've actually made something, and that gives me some more legitimacy on Kickstarter.
Right, exactly. Well, yeah, so it's this 1950s suburbia, kind of Ravenloft-ish, but let me back up a bit. What plane does this take place on? Like, I know Ravenloft is its own kind of plane within the D&D multiverse, and Earth is technically its own plane, but the planes, like, at that point are sort of separated on another level. So there's like sort of Greyhawk, and then Greyhawk's outer planes, and there's like Faerun is like in this sort of separate multiverse that's still connected through something.
Mm-hmm.
and this is all stuff that I think Guy Jackson and Ed Greenwood put together that felt like just like you can have a multiverse of multiverses.
Yeah. And honestly, for this project, it can kind of take place anywhere. I'm basically saying that it's its own little mini dimension that is disconnected from the rest of the world. So you can use it for pretty much anything.
Okay, so I could potentially drop this if I wanted to. Like, it's this hidden valley somewhere within, like, my personal, like, ancient Greek campaign setting, or I
Yeah.
could use it in someone else's, like, normal kind of medieval setting, or in a
Yeah.
D20 modern kind of thing.
Yeah, so I can talk a little bit more about how that works. The so I like I said, I have an adventure that comes with it, and the adventure assumes that you're starting in generic D&D land. You have to go talk to some noble who, for some reason, this paladin disappeared from their fancy party. So even within the product itself, I'm kind of acknowledging that most people are going to need some help getting into the setting.
Mm-hmm.
But the core way you get into the setting itself is this angry little magic item called the Universal Remote, which is a TV remote that will deliberately take the shape of whatever area it's in. So, like if it's in fantasy world, it will maybe look wooden with some metallic buttons, or if it's in a steampunk setting, it'll be covered in gears and whatnot.
Right.
But this angry little contraption just kind of floats around the multiverse, and it the lore that I've written for it is that it automatically attunes itself to whoever nearby has the most authority, and then it waits for people to denigrate that person, and it just zaps them into Serenity Springs. That's kind of the long and short of it, and that it kind of ties into the larger lore of Serenity Springs being all about perfection and obeying authority and all that kind of stuff, which I can get into later. But that's kind of how you get into it. So, like I said, with that mechanism, you can pretty much have it show up anywhere you want.
Okay. So, like, if someone disrespects authority, then they get zapped to Serenity Springs as sort of a punishment if they're next to the remote.
Yeah, and honestly, it's all set out as relatively vague and relatively broad on purpose, just to make things straightforward and easy.
Okay. Yeah, one of my other questions was definitely how do you fit normal D&D characters into a setting like that, because obviously the magic ones don't really make sense within American Suburbia, but a lot of the more like marshals also don't quite make sense.
Mm-hmm.
Like a ranger, wielding two swords and knowing how to like track animals doesn't really fit within like 1950s suburban dad or suburban housewife kind of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's part of the fun of it, in my mind. And it even gets kind of meta too, because for once, when players are playing in this setting, they're going to know more about the setting than their characters do, which is normally it's completely the opposite, right? Normally your characters know a lot more about the setting than you do.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a fun little inversion there. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Player characters don't fit in, and that is part of the design. I guess I can go into a little bit more of the lore here for that in particular.
Yeah.
Like I said, it's inspired by Ravenloft, and one of the core tenets of Ravenloft is that there's one person who did something horrible, and this domain is created to torment them. And the person in this situation is a housewife named Dotty Davis, and she lived in essentially 1950s America. Although I'm in the document itself, I abstracted away to make it not explicitly the U.S. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
anyway, she lived in that she lived in not America, and her country was fighting not Russia and dealing with not communism, and she fell hook, line, and sinker for the propaganda of the time. Was a staunch anti-communist and tried to keep the world kind of perfect in every way. And over the years, she became more and more insistent about that kind of thing until she well, not sure how deep to go into this, but uh, she took her perfection too far and eventually ended up murdering a bunch of people, and that's how she got trapped in this domain.
Yeah, the little blurb that you sent me made it seem kind of like Hot Fuzz for what she was trying to do.
Oh yeah, 100%. Yep. Hot fuzz is one of the things in the inspiration list. But yeah, so the idea is that she is in this black and white suburb that looks like the one that she had her best times in, that she does have a lot of control over, and people kind of fear and venerate her. But she's always trying to make it perfect. And of course, perfection doesn't really exist, and one's definition of perfection is always shifting. And so it's kind of that in and of itself is a difficulty. But then making it even worse, and to what you were saying with Hot Fuzz, there is a group that comes around called the Best Burb Committee that judges the suburb. And of course, she never wins. She will never ever win, and there are no other contestants even. But it's just another way of tormenting her. The way this ties back to the player characters, sorry, I've had to explain all that stuff, is one of the core torments is that every so often Serenity Springs will be attacked by monsters. Any D&D monster or player character and anything you want will just emerge in the realm. And anything that is not human is referred to as a commie. Communism in general has completely lost all meaning here. It's just you are human or you are a commie, period.
I was thinking in my head that the drift of commie to not really have any meaning kind of matches how it's used in American politics today as well.
Yeah, absolutely. There are some layers of that in here too. Um, but yeah, so anything from the multiverse can emerge in Serenity Springs as a commie, essentially. And so the player characters who look more human can pass as human, and the ones who do not will not. And that is an interesting dynamic in and of itself. Is it's the people of Serenity Springs trust some of the player characters and run terrified from others immediately.
Like the half orc is not going to have any friends.
Yep, exactly. So yeah, the player characters will immediately have a kind of strange time from that.
That's interesting because I feel like most adventures don't have a lot of social scenarios to navigate. It's much more like dungeon or puzzles or that kind of thing. And having it be more like, how do you get these people to want to talk with you? With this additional, I assume, hidden layer that none of these people are real either.
I'll be totally honest. I've gone back and forth about whether or not these people are real, and I can't come up with a good answer, so I'm not going to put one in, at least at the moment.
Well, I think there's a good answer from my experience is that at some point it doesn't matter. The
Yeah,
players don't know initially, and then they must treat these people as if they're real because the
yeah,
other alternative is horrific. So, um, yeah, it doesn't matter. You're right.
yeah, I agree.
So I had all these lists of 1950s tropes that I wanted to ask about. Like Cold War, we already kind of covered. There's also this element of the nuclear family of having, dad goes to work, mom stays home, housemaker, because we don't have all these machines that make life easier yet, and kids are in school, that kind of thing. Is that still kind of the vibe to the town?
Um, for the most part, that's actually one of the places where things got a little delicate as I was just putting all of this stuff together. And the 1950s were a time of a lot of yeah, exactly as you were saying, just like a very, very strict societal structure with strict expectations and everything. And I'm playing with that for sure, but at the same time, I'm sensitive to making this a setting that's about oppression, or that tries to tell stories that I'm not necessarily equipped to tell, that focuses too much, or that focuses a lot on oppressing minorities, or the strict family dynamic, or any of that kind of stuff. Essentially, there's a lot of complexity there, that I think RPGs can explore, but I didn't particularly feel equipped to here. There's actually a big kind of disclaimer paragraph at the very beginning of this document, kind of explaining what I just said. Um, so I'm basically letting the GM do as much or as little of that as I want without really codifying it. The only real discrimination is, are you a human or are you a commie? And I'm just kind of leaving it at that. And like I said, individual GMs can like mold that into more 1950s restricted or less, depending on the kind of experience they want to give.
Gotcha. Yeah. No, I'd mentioned that prior to the interview that the setting seemed kind of like Pleasantville, that movie, to me,
Hmm.
where that much more explicitly deals with like whites and coloreds, and also with the way that movie functions with it switching from black and white to colored. Um, and that's the point of that movie, but it's easier to approach those themes with nuance and respect when it is a controlled narrative, and RPGs don't have that. And often people are using it as a method of escape from reality and don't want to deal with that stuff when they're inserting themselves into the story.
Yeah. Yeah, very well said. That's very much how I feel about it. And like I said, I think those kinds of things can be explored in RPGs really well, but it takes a level of specificity and delicateness that I don't really want to engage with. And if anything, I'm deliberately not doing here, because there are a lot of things in this that are not at all subtle, like just really, really trying to invoke very specific ideas. Like, for instance, I have a friend who's doing a soundtrack for this project, and he was asking what he should do for the aliens, because of course there's classic 1950 style aliens in this setting.
Mm-hmm.
And my note to him was theremin, theremin ass theremin. Just that,
That was what I
just
was thinking too.
yeah,
There's one
exactly,
option
right.
for an instrument, and you have to use that one.
Yes, exactly. So in the places like that where there's a really, really obvious thing to hammer on, I'm hitting that really hard, like because I want people to recognize those things and have a unique D&D experience where they get to play with those icons of that time, and really recognize them.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. So the going back a bit, there's this nuclear family that, I mean, you're not really exploring like the gender dynamics and that kind of stuff with it, but the setting still suggests that this is mostly a residential area with, families and children and schools. And most D&D adventures don't actually deal with children very much. Like if they're there, they're like heavily in the background for how I've seen most modules written.
Mhm.
Whereas this seems like they'd be much more in the foreground for what's happening. Like, kids are playing outside on the street, and then a commie shows up and someone has to rescue them. How have you incorporated that, if at all?
Um, I'll be honest, I haven't addressed children specifically in this. There are a few like random encounters you can have with them. Like, of course, there's a random encounter that's a lemonade stand, and there's a random encounter that there's some kids who want you to play baseball with them, and you have no idea what baseball even is because you're a D&D
Mm-hmm.
character. But that's about the extent of it as far as dealing with children goes. That again, children is one of those things that is so it can be so delicate that I didn't want to be too specific about it and kind of let people handle that as they would. As far as the general safety of it goes, this is a world where the commie attacks are commonplace and people are very like it's a thing that they know happens. And so there are some mechanisms in place to protect people, and I'm just kind of leaning on that. Uh, that's part of Dottie's torment, is that she is basically the best fighter and is always in the front lines dealing with whatever commie is showing up. But of course, what 1950s setting would be complete without some G-men, basically government spooks? She has a whole army of those that help her fight the commies off, and basically between all of that lore, the place is as safe or unsafe as the GM wants to make it.
Okay. But it also seems like because this is sort of a constructed reality, like you could just say there really aren't children that exist outside of the lemonade stand and the baseball game.
Yeah, for sure. And maybe I'll add that in to my sensitivity note at some point to tell the GM to make a decision around that. Because again, it doesn't feel like the kind of thing that I would want to decide specifically, but GM should be aware that it might be an issue that would come up in the future in while playing.
Yeah, within safety tools, like child endangerment is a relatively frequent one. So
Yeah.
that was something I definitely wanted to see where the module was landing. Well, yeah, you mentioned the G-men, and based off the kind of vibe I was getting from reading about the setting, it seemed like this was kind of a place to bring a lot of like sci-fi B movie tropes into. You know, like there's a giant ant attacking the town, or a swamp monster or something, and those are the commies, and then you have the G-men come in and shoot it with their guns and solve the problem.
Yep.
So that's kind of how stuff exists within equilibrium, and then the players come in and kind of upset the equilibrium. Is that the general idea?
Yeah. It really depends on what kind of adventure happens. But yeah, that's rough. That is what normal life looks like here. And I'm glad you said giant ants, because that's also an image that I immediately pictured when I was setting this up. I forget what the movie is, but there's some old 1950s movie where a town of miniatures essentially gets overrun by enormous ants, and it's both silly and terrifying.
It's probably like Attack of the Giant Ants or something. Like
Yeah.
they're always named something extremely simple like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. You also mentioned aliens, which still kind of fits within that trope, but I feel like some representations of aliens are not always antagonistic. Are these ones still like portrayed that way?
Uh, Mostly, yeah. They're their own faction within Serenity Springs, and like I said, they're classic Roswell gray aliens with psychic powers and ray guns and shields and that kind of thing. Their motivation is they are fascinated with magic powers. They don't have magic powers in and of themselves, and so they abduct. Sometimes they abduct commies to try to learn about it. And I think I also wrote in that they're part of a larger species that is trying to morph itself to look more and more humanoid, so that they can infiltrate human society or humanoid
Okay.
societies. And yeah, the adventure that I'm including does go into a lot of depth with them, because you have to the paladin that you're rescuing turns out was actually abducted by them, and you have to go to their air base and inside their landed UFO and fight a bunch of them. And yeah, it's fun.
Cool. And you said there's like a broader like race they're part of, or like other types of aliens besides Greys that show up, or is that more just like theoretical?
That's more theoretical. I really just wanted to make the classic 1950s ones and put them in there. If people want to pull in mind flayers, the classic D&D alien, that could also work in here as well.
There is a component of the like Dotty being opposed to commies showing up that I thought was interesting for having an adventure set here, where the PCs show up and you could have it sort of go almost like two different adventures. One where they're all quasi people, like human, elf, dwarf, and halfling are all close enough to humans that you could probably get away with it. Or if you have any races that are beyond that, they would probably be labeled as commies, so like tieflings being a pretty obvious one, which would then probably have the players be in a adversarial relationship with Dotty and the G agents, G-men. How did you handle that? Because it almost seems like you'd almost have to have two separate adventures for that.
Yeah, so in the adventure that I wrote for this, like I said, players are going in to rescue a paladin. The paladin had been pulled in a while before, and Dottie met her, was impressed by her, brainwashed her into basically serving with the G-men, and now the paladin is also missing. So when the players show up, they do cause a bit of a ruckus because presumably there's a tiefling among them, and Dotty will show up and basically rescue them, for lack of a better word, because she recognizes that they are from the same place that the paladin was from. And I wrote in a very specific excuse in here that Dottie will say for any non-humanoid looking characters that like this poor soul was clearly mutated by nuclear radiation. And I have a note like, hey, the characters can use that as a way of de-escalating things in the future. Because, that's another classic trope of that time period is nuclear radiation will do all kinds of horrible things to people and well beyond the leaps or well beyond what we know it actually does.
Yeah, I mean, that's the entire thought process for many superheroes in Marvel Comics.
Yeah. Superheroes and villains and monsters and all kinds of different things. So it seemed like a good universal catch-all for that kind of problem.
Yeah. There was something that I wasn't quite getting from the Universal Remote's relationship here through all of this. I get that it wants to respect authority and is somehow linked to Serenity Springs. And Dottie is imprisoned here as some sort of punishment, but her punishment isn't quite disrespecting authority. It's more abusing it, and that why people would be brought here as some sort of punishment for disrespecting authority compared to something else. I don't know. I'm trying to make a connection here for something logical, and maybe that's a mistake, and we don't need logic here, and we just need some adventure hook to get people here.
No, it's totally reasonable, and there is an element of nightmare logic and things not quite making sense, and that's part of it. But I've tried to make things as cohesive as possible. So as far as the universal remote goes, I kind of just, like I said, it's just a simple way of getting any sort of entity into Serenity Springs, and it's not the punishment that it's doling out isn't godly punishment. It's an angry little device that doesn't like people who denigrate authority, and that was just a good way to get a thematic connection with Dottie, who also doesn't like anyone who denigrates authority. I will also say the universal remote itself does exist within Serenity Springs, and it's one of Dottie's main tools for being able to project herself into everyone's TVs and that kind of thing. But yeah, it's a little shaky on the logic, but again, that's not a core part of it, and I might tighten that up as it goes. A lot of this has just been writing the adventure and reworking the logic and that kind of back and forth of game design.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think when you read the full document, it mostly makes sense.
Okay, cool. I was curious about also how TV and radio served as social functions within Serenity Springs, because within the traditional 1950s view, that was very much how it was the beginning of TV, and radio was still a very important source of news and social activity as well. People would listen to shows on the radio and then talk about them. Similar to what we do for TV now, but so it sounds like those are kind of controlled by Dottie within your setup.
Yeah, not so much on the radio side, but I have tried to make it so that there's a TV in almost every map that I make for the setting, and that there are TVs everywhere, and that Dottie can use them to project whatever she wants, and can also use them to spy. It felt like the kind of thing that does have to be in the world, especially since the way you get in is with a TV remote.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Well, the spying component is interesting.
Yeah, well, it's basically a police state. All of the G-men are spying on people. Dottie deliberately does not want anybody subverting her authority or going against what she commands, and everybody is putting on a happy face regardless of how they actually feel about the place.
Yeah. Oh, there was something I forgot earlier that I'm remembering now that is probably, I already have an answer to it, but the sort of mono religion as part of like the monoculture of the 1950s, where everyone is Christian and goes to church on at least Easter and Christmas. I'm assuming that that is not included here to avoid those same kind of social issues you were talking about before.
Yep, exactly. All of these social issues are things that I have thoughts about and have studied and considered and talked about with friends, but like it's just at a certain point it's just not worth including in
Yeah,
a
yeah,
fun game.
yeah. It feels like that would almost be a distraction instead of focusing on what you're trying to do with it.
Yeah.
Well, I'm curious where the adventure goes because it feels like okay, they have these aliens are antagonistic and kind of Dotty also like behind the scenes seems like she's an antagonistic figure, and ultimately the PC's goal here is probably do what we can to help people and then get out of here back to our world. And I'm assuming there's a confrontation there that gets them there. But it also feels like we don't want to give away too much spoilers for, for people that might be listening.
Yeah. Um, yeah, the mission or the adventure itself is pretty complicated. Well, it's not complicated. It's just there's a fair amount going on, and it really what I'm trying to do with it is I'm trying to emphasize all of the little interesting, weird parts of Serenity Springs. In the interest of avoiding spoilers, maybe just like what's your main question about it? I'm happy to answer that. We can just call it there.
I just clarifying that, there is a larger I don't know what my question was there to be honest.
No worries.
I was curious how much you wanted to share for where it went next within the adventure without like just, spouting off what the end conclusion is.
Yeah, I mean, you pretty much have the arc already. Like as you said, you the players also get pulled into Serenity Springs. They have to find this person that they're trying to rescue and rescue them, and then get back out. That's the large arc of it. But of course, that is complicated by G-men and aliens and controlling housewives.
Right. Well, yeah, okay, enough said. There was something else you mentioned in the press kit that you sent me about the haze. So I wanted to give some time to talk about that.
Yeah, so that's another core element of this. And again, in so Ravenloft has its famous mists that are a kind of sentient, malevolent force that keeps the boundaries between the realms and all that kind of thing. I have my own version of that that I call the haze. And it's similar to the mist, but it is a more like TV static, because of course it is.
Right.
And it serves a few different functions. For one, it's kind of it's what emerges when a kami attack happens. So like a patch of haze will show up and a kami will emerge from it, or player characters or what have you. So that's one of its functions. Another one of its functions is censorship. This is a perfect happy-go-lucky 1950s neighborhood. So anything that's violence gets censored by the haze. Any sexuality gets censored by the haze. It's a manifestation of that kind of prudishness. And one of the fun things with censoring violence specifically is that that actually has a mechanical impact in Serenity Springs, where when a PC takes damage, you don't tell them how much damage they took. You just tell them they took damage, and they
Ooh.
feel they know they took something, and you don't even have to really describe specifically what happened. I remember I remember with fondness when my players played through this setting, and I attacked them for the first time, and I'm like, "You take some damage," and the player looked at like, "How much damage?" Oh no, it'd be much too violent to tell you how much damage you took. Um, of course, they can get around that. I wrote in that you can take an action to do a medicine check against a creature's AC to see what their health is at that moment. But, that's not a great use of an action. So just adds that other little layer of tension. Um, the other thing that I want to highlight here is the haze is spelled Hayze, which is a weird spelling, but it has a specific reason, and that's because I'm referencing the Hays Code, which
Yes,
was,
I thought that's what you were doing.
yeah, glad you got that. Yeah, so for folks who might not know, the Hays Code was a censorship system in the, I forget the exact years, but it was in the 50s through the 60s, and it's the reason that all of the old 1950s TV and radio and whatnot kind of have the styles they do. Um,
There were so many like small rules that were part of it, but one of the bigger ones is that like people couldn't be evil and get away with it. That was the
yeah,
requirement of it.
yeah,
So you couldn't
exactly.
make a movie where like the evil guys win. It wasn't
Yeah.
allowed.
Yep. Or you couldn't show even if a couple was like married, you couldn't show them getting into the same bed at night. I think that was like something that showed up in I Love Lucy or something like that. But
Uh,
it's this whole fascinating history of weird self-censorship that it just the name matched so perfectly with what I was trying to evoke that I had to put that funny spelling in.
yeah, they couldn't show dead people. They couldn't show drugs or drinking. There was like severe nudity restrictions. Like you basically couldn't show people in like even in their underwear.
Yep.
And underwear was bigger back then. Like it
Yeah.
covered a lot more. Um, Gambling was another one, and there was a lot of restrictions on where guns could be pointed. There was a lot of stuff, and yeah, eventually people just got tired of it, and it wasn't a legal code. It was more like just most movies will not be shown in theaters that don't follow these.
Yeah, it was very similar to our like our modern movie rating system, like PG-13, R, etc. That system isn't a legal system. It's just something that movies follow, and if you don't follow that, you don't get distribution. And it was something like that, but much more comprehensive.
Yeah, and it was more like a yes or a no, and the rating was either basically G or I would say probably PG-13 was what a no would be in many of the things,
Hmm.
even less in some of them. But um, yes, our
Yeah,
modern rating system is better because there's more nuance. We still can kind of get to the same place. Like X is basically no, this is not being shown anywhere.
yeah,
Um,
but yeah, it was a nice circumstance that reference worked so well. And I guess one thing that I should throw in, probably should have answered this during the very first question, but I'm also a history major, and
mhm.
so that I'm a history major who is also a programmer. So I don't use my degree for anything, and but it made an impact on me, and so I'm. My interest in history definitely bleeds into it's one of the main reasons I'm doing this project in the first place, and it helps me to pull things like the Hays Code. Um, and I've always been kind of fascinated with this specific period of time because it's so influential on modern America in ways that it's just really elaborate and really uh, man, I'm rambling. Sorry, running out of brain space for a second here.
No, I think it's a cool, like, larger concept. The Hays Code is just really part of it, but like this general idea of like, Americans are our culture largely descends from like Puritan settlers from England. So there's a lot of really Puritan ideas for how our culture represents things and like about sex and violence and having them be not something that's very publicly discussed, if ever. Um, that there's been more pushback now with after the Hays Code went out of style in the late 60s and early 70s. And it's fun to go back and explore those themes and look at what would the world be like if you ran a D&D adventure that still had that kind of concept. And
Yeah.
the censoring violence is a fascinating way to do that.
Oh yeah. It's gonna cause some terror, and that's exactly what I want.
Yeah. Um, I think you'd also mentioned that the haze is kind of what's summoning the commies to the town. Is
Yeah.
that part of the sort of hellish punishment for Dotty.
Yeah, exactly. It's the haze is kind of its own malevolent force, and it can work as all-purpose plot insulator for weird nonsense that doesn't fully make sense, like monsters appearing out of nowhere. And it's just one of those things that fits really nicely in. Um, and the townsfolk know to avoid the haze because if it's not about to summon a monster, it's probably censoring something. It's its own strange little force.
So this is interesting to me because it seems like the haze is trying to create a punishment for Dottie that is almost but not quite her perfect reality. So she's constantly annoyed as she's trying to fix stuff to make it perfect.
Yeah, for sure. And that's just part of the torment. And I will admit there's definitely a degree of personal expression there because I tend to be very much a perfectionist myself, and
Mm.
I struggle with how to manifest that in ways that are productive. And uh, yeah, there's a degree of putting myself in the work by having the villain of the story be an extreme version of perfectionism.
Well, write what you know, right?
Yep.
Well, we've about reached the end of like my prepared questions here. I'm sure there's more you might want to share though. Do you have anything else you want to talk about?
Yeah. One other small thing that I want to throw in that's part of the censorship, and this might have been maybe the first thing I came up with for Serenity Springs. There is a small creature called the swear jar, which is a little mason jar with wings that says swear jar on it. And it's full of quarters. And whenever a person swears, including a PC, it just magically appears and zaps you, and removes one permanent HP, which is, not nothing, but pretty annoying until you give it some money to pay for the crime of swearing. Um,
Uh,
and that was another really fun one where when I ran this a while ago, back of my head, I was like, it's probably not going to come up for a while. Like, I think my players they had just gone shopping and got like some fancy new clothes, and they show up in this domain or in this place that's all black and white. And the character just swears loudly that his fancy green cloak doesn't look cool anymore. And I'm like, huh, funny you did that. And the swear jar shows up and zaps him, and then throughout the entire campaign, they keep asking me like, hey, are there quarters behind this couch cushion or anything? So
they couldn't use like gold pieces for that.
no, 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 no. I put that in the thing as
Oh,
well. Like normal currency from wherever you're from is useless. You have to use the actual currency in the domain.
okay. That's cool.
Yeah.
And that's one that I feel like is would be interesting having that cross into like a meta territory where like you also can't swear as a player because otherwise your character will be punished.
Oh, geez. Yeah. Yeah. The number of ways that this sets you up to torment your players is extensive.
Yeah, and it's not necessarily about like being mean to your players, but getting them to really feel like their characters.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. And then I got kind of rambly earlier, but I did want to talk about the history part a little bit. And
Yeah.
so, like I said, it's a time that I'm really interested in because it's such an important part of how we modern Americans view ourselves, for better and for worse. To the extent that "Make America Great Again" means anything coherent, the time period they're referring to is this one, I think, because it was a time period that was it's viewed as it was perfect and homogenous and everything was great. And so it's just one of the things that I've wanted to explore as my own way of kind of dealing with being a modern American and all of the complexity that entails, and all of the ways in which we kind of paper over the complexity of the past without fully acknowledging it. Um,
Hmm.
we were talking about the Hays Code earlier. Even that is something that has some complexity to it because we I think most people nowadays rightly agree that it was a terrible thing and shouldn't have happened, and probably caused a lot of harm to artists and set art back quite a bit. But at the same time, there was some real beauty that came from the limitations that were set out. Like, I remember a while ago, I sat down and watched a bunch of the old Twilight Zone that came out during that time period. And the ways in which they were able to evoke horror and mystery and all kinds of things while still falling within this very, very, very strict parameter was really, really interesting. And they were able to, they weren't able to fall to use the same tricks that you would normally fall back on for those genres. And so, yeah, some real value and beauty came out of something that was kind of crap. And obviously the inverse applies a lot as well. So yeah, I'm generally really interested in history, and I think we paper over a lot of the complexity of it in ways that doesn't serve us well. And this is a lot of this setting is me kind of wanting to explore and express that myself.
Yeah. I think that's definitely true. Like, a way to make someone creative is sometimes to give them a limitation that they have to work within.
Mm-hmm.
And the Hays Code was like that for many kinds of stories. Like, one that I remember was that a lot of movies you couldn't show, like, you could barely show kissing. So how did you show, like, infidelity as part of a story? Well, you showed a shot of a man and a woman going into a room and them closing the door, and then you'd, like, zoom in on the door.
Yeah.
And that was it. But that conveyed that those characters went in there and had sex.
Yeah.
Just that's a really unique way of telling stories that we don't really see anymore. It's now like, if it doesn't happen on camera, then it like doesn't exist within the movie, is this like modern idea for storytelling, when it used to be much more subtle with what was happening, but everyone still kind of understood it because that's the way all movies were.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And I just, stories in history are so elaborate and impossible to know all the angles of, that it's, I don't know, I feel like it serves us well to get as much of an understanding of it as we can. It's a pretty generic thing, but it's something that I've felt for a long time, and especially nowadays when it feels like we really don't understand our history. Yeah.
All right. Okay.
Yeah.
I always cap off the show by asking for some DMing advice that you want to give to people. So what do you have for that?
Okay. The go-to for me is that your players will never care about what you create as much as they care about what they create. Meaning, most of the time, meaning their characters. Like, you can make the most elaborate world with the most elaborate lore you want, but if it doesn't impact their character, they're not going to care all that much. And that sucks for some people, but it can also be really, really powerful. And the lesson here is, let your players make more than just their characters. Like I said, I did this Ravenloft campaign a long time ago, and in that campaign, they were hopping from domain to domain, and they needed a home base, some town. And I didn't really want to make that town myself because it was not part of the game that interested me, but it needed to exist. And I actually had my players play this RPG called I'm Sorry, Did You Say Street Magic? And that's a small one-session game where you make a city. And they made their city. I guided it a tiny bit. And then that became their home city. And they cared about that place, again, so much more than anything that I would have made, which made it much more interesting to threaten and add to and expand on. And it ended up being like a centerpiece of the game. And it went really, really well. So yeah, the core thing is, let your players create more than just their characters.
Yeah, no, that's cool advice. I feel like every campaign I've had, it's always been, I've always let my players insert themselves in much more concrete ways, and it's felt good compared to the campaigns where I haven't done that.
Mm-hmm.
Which was a long time ago when I was less experienced. Well, yeah. Where can people find Serenity Springs? You said it's going to launch in mid-March, and we'll have a a better idea of that once this episode comes out, so you can stay tuned for a more exact date. But what do we have at the moment?
Yeah, so there is a pre-backer page. It's pretty easy to find. Just go to Kickstarter and look for Serenity Springs. You can find all of my work at grinningportalgames.com. It's where I've posted a few blog posts and my other supplements that I've made. Like I said, I made that time loop train adventure. I've also made an adventure for Monster of the Week and a few free supplements for Monster of the Week and masks. But yeah, that's where most of my stuff can be found. You'll probably be hearing from me more in the future once the Kickstarter actually gets up and running. But yeah, I'm excited to put it out there and see how people feel about it.
Yeah, awesome. All right, thanks, Ryan. It was great talking to you.
Thanks, you too.
Hope you like listening to Ryan talk about Serenity Springs. His company, Grinning Portal Games, is going to be releasing it on Kickstarter soon. He's planning on starting the Kickstarter in April. You can go to the episode description and click on the link there to follow the campaign ahead of time. So then once it launches, you'll be notified and you can see all the rewards and get whatever one you want. So yeah, check that out. Appreciate all the listeners of the podcast. If you enjoyed this, then please follow it on whatever you're listening to on so you can get more of the episodes right when they release. And as always, we thank our patron, Darren, and thank everyone else for listening.